All righty, looks like we got about 21 folks joined here, so I think we're good to go ahead and get started. So thanks everyone who joined this afternoon. This is the CircleCI 101 webinar where we're going to go over kind of some of the basics of CircleCI and talk about how the platform works and how some of the features stand out from some of the other CI/CD solutions out there. So just before we get too deep into it, who am I? My name is Jennings. I'm a solutions engineer here at CircleCI for the APAC region. And my primary responsibility is to provide technical guidance for APAC region companies who are interested in using CircleCI. But I also work on some of the customer-facing code that is used to extend the application, mostly orbs, which we'll talk about in this presentation. So, and here's my GitHub if you want to check out some of the demos and other things I've written for CircleCI. So first, a quick agenda, kind of give you an outline of what we're going to talk about today. So first, a quick intro to CircleCI as a company, just a little about us spiel. And then we'll go through a product demo, a very basic one that goes over some of the kind of terms that we use in CircleCI, kind of the most basic use case for the tool and the platform, and a little bit of the configuration syntax and with how to navigate the user interface and kind of what you're looking at in the UI. Then we'll go over some of the core features that set CircleCI apart from some of the other CI/CD solutions out there. And then we'll talk about some other use cases that might be relevant to our attendees here today that are kind of outside the main use case. And we'll cap it all off with a Q&A. So if you guys got questions along the way, please definitely toss them into the Zoom Q&A window there, and we'll go ahead and try to answer as many of those as we have time for at the end. So this is our mission statement. This is kind of the overall idea behind CircleCI as a product. So what are we trying to accomplish with CircleCI? Our mission is to make it as easy as possible for you to go from an idea you have to delivering that idea, be it in the form of an app to your customers, or deploying it on a public cloud service, or even on-prem, or wherever you need to have the end result deployed. And we want to take out the friction in the process between having an idea, developing that idea, testing it, and collaborating with other developers on the team, and then operations and kind of the whole shebang that goes into creating an application. So who are we as a company? CircleCI was founded in 2011. Now we have over 500 employees scattered across 5 different continents. And we are currently the world's largest shared CI/CD platform. And we are built with the cloud in mind, cloud first, right? We have over 1 million builds per day running on our platform. And down here, you can see some of the logos that use CircleCI as their primary CI/CD tool. You might recognize some of these names. You've got Kickstarter, Coinbase, Spotify, Segment, Facebook. Gatsby is a big company here in Japan, where I'm based. I'm based in Tokyo. So we're familiar not just with startup, the challenges that startups face and small and medium businesses, but also larger enterprises and even government agencies. Although we don't have any logos for them down here, right? But we do have some public sector clients as well. So as far as where CircleCI kind of sits in the grand scheme of things, we are sort of at the orchestration phase of developing a product, right? So on the left-hand side, we have creation. That's where you're going to be using mostly source control, and you're going to be writing kind of the beginning of the product and maybe putting together like an MVP and collaborating with these source control tools. Right now, CircleCI supports integrating with GitHub and Bitbucket, but we are fast working toward VCS agnosticism, which will allow you to trigger pipelines from hopefully any VCS provider, or even without a VCS provider. That's top of our roadmap, but it's not quite out yet. Then onto the orchestration stage, and that's where CircleCI sits. We help you build, test, and deliver your software. And then, as you can see down here, we integrate with we have many partners, and there's many third-party integrations that slot into CircleCI to kind of extend the platform. And then finally, CircleCI is great for building and testing your product and delivering it somewhere, but you can't run your production environment on CircleCI. It's not a cloud provider, so that's where you have this phase, this logistics phase, that's going to consist of monitoring your production environment and operating it on a platform like AWS, GCP. I know there's a lot of Azure users out here in the APAC region, and using tools like Docker, so Kubernetes, right? So we sit sort of in the middle between your VCS and the eventual platforms on which you will host the finished product. Before we go too much further, I wanted to talk a bit about CircleCI's security features and the compliance certifications that we have. And the reason this is here early on in the presentation and not a side note at the end is that we take security very seriously. Like, as a cloud platform and a cloud like first company, we understand that there's a lot of, maybe you could say, fear around moving workloads to the cloud and storing sensitive data in the cloud. So we've endeavored to make sure that our platform is a very tight ship. And here's just some of the security features that we offer our customers who run workloads in CircleCI. So kind of going, again, mirroring this diagram that I showed you a minute ago: creation, orchestration, and logistics. Going from left to right here, from your VCS provider, when you run a job, you will obviously need to clone or pull down some of the code to build or test, right? Or even to package it up and ship it. When you clone a repo from your version control provider, that's going to be sent to CircleCI through an encrypted connection. And then once that code is on a Docker container, say, or a Linux or Windows VM, Mac OS VM, your builds and tests are going to run. And as soon as that job is done, that VM or container that ran your code is going to be destroyed. So the point is that outside of these ephemeral VMs and containers, we don't store any copies of your source code on our platform. So you can be sure that you're not having sensitive data spread out in places where you can't control it. Oftentimes we have customers who run tests and they want to have their test logs easily accessible from the CircleCI UI. So they actually upload test logs or security scan results, things like that, to CircleCI itself so that you can pull them down from the user interface. Those artifacts that I just talked about are stored in private buckets that are only available to you and your authenticated users. So they're encrypted at rest and they're encrypted in transit when you pull them down. So you can be sure that those are also being properly secured. And then finally, down here, it's often very helpful to be able to store secrets. Think of like API tokens for integrating with third-party services, maybe something like, I don't know, Catalan, or if you need to deploy to AWS, you might need a secret access key and access key pair. When you store secrets like that in CircleCI, they are going to be encrypted at rest and, of course, in transit. And then you can also restrict who is able to access these variables. If you're a GitHub user or a GitHub using organization, you can restrict those based on GitHub's teams. So I'm just barely scratching the surface here. We have some more resources in this slide deck that we'll send to you after this presentation, where you can kind of dig around more in depth to see some more of our security features and the actual standards we use. Then down here, here's some of the logos of the compliance standards that we're compliant under. So I think some of you might have heard of the EU-US Privacy Shield and Cloud Security Alliance. In the APAC region, I don't know how many folks are familiar with FedRAMP, but that's the US government's federal compliance standard, national level compliance standard. It's very onerous and difficult to get, so we're pretty proud of being FedRAMP compliant. And I guess the upshot of this slide is that we want to make sure that anyone from a startup, a small business, a large enterprise, a national government, a company working in finance or another sensitive industry can feel sure that CircleCI is secure enough for them to be able to use as a cloud platform. And here are some links that after this presentation, we can, if you guys are interested, you can go ahead and click on these and dig more into our security, the details of our security. So moving along, I want to go through a very, very high level product demo. to kind of give you a sense of what the product looks like, you know, from the UI and not just talking about it in the abstract here through a slide deck. So I'm going to jump over to a project that I've cloned just for this demo. And we can see I've got a failed build here. That's not a problem. That's just because I wanted to only run the build job. I didn't actually want to deploy it for this demo because we're not going to go ahead and fiddle with the app. We just want to see what the you know, what a single job looks like. So no worries here. But just going, oh yeah, so just to talk about what we're looking at here, this is the CircleCI user interface. And right now I'm looking at a single project, this CircleCI demo Python Flask project. There's different ways to filter here. We can filter by you know, everyone's pipelines or just my own. I can look at different projects. You can see I have a lot of different projects set up in my CircleCI organization. And you can also grab a particular branch on a project if you're interested. Here we have the pipeline name, and it's just going to be the name of the repository and the number. So this is the first pipeline I've ran with this project, you know, but if you run a lot, this will quickly increase to, you know, the dozens or hundreds or thousands. The status of the pipeline, this one didn't complete successfully because I didn't put the necessary information in for the deploy job to complete. And then here we have the workflow, that this particular workflow in this pipeline, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. And then we have the user that ran this, that kicked off, committed the code that triggered this pipeline, the branch and commit hash, and then when it started and how long it ran for, right? So if we drill down into one of the, oh, actually, let's click on the workflow first and take a look at that. So in this workflow, we see we have two jobs, a build job that runs first, and then a deploy job that runs after it. These run sequentially, and that's because we've configured it to run that way in the config file, and I'll point that out. I'll kind of show you what that looks like in a moment. We've got more of the same information that I pointed out up here earlier. And if we go into if we click on one of these rectangles, we can actually go into the output for one of these jobs and see what it actually did. So again, up here we have a lot of information, a little like kind of dashboard pane. How long it ran, when it finished, right? That's pretty self-explanatory. More interesting is the queued and preparing time. Queued is going to tell you how long it took for, I guess, how long your container had to wait in line, right? Or your VM had to wait in line in order to get resources provisioned for it. Luckily, on the cloud platform, we have a gigantic amount of resources available to us. So it usually takes less than a second to get in line and actually have resources provisioned to run our job. And then the preparation time is going to tell me how long it took for my execution environment to spin up. And then over here, we can actually see what the execution environment is. Here, in this case, it's a Docker container that's spun up, and it says Docker medium. Medium tells us the size of the container, right? And I don't know if you guys or if you folks are anything like me, but I always have trouble remembering you know, what a T3X large is, or an M5 XX large, and all of those different instance sizes. So fortunately for people like me, they put a little tooltip in here. You can just hover over that and see that a Docker medium has 2 CPUs and 4 gigs of RAM. So we also have the branch and the author here again. And then down here, we have a long list of collapsible like items. And at first, this might be a little bit confusing, but I think it makes sense if you take a look at the CircleCI config.yaml file. So this is going to be checked into your repository, but it's also viewable from the CircleCI UI. So I'm just going to go ahead and open that really quick so we can map what's in the UI with what's in the pipeline config here. So if I jump over to this, I will see that I have a lot of jobs defined here. And or I have 2 jobs, actually, not a lot, my mistake. So we have 2 jobs. We have build and we have deploy. And if I expand out, excuse me, if I expand out build, I'll see that we have a lot of steps. And each of these steps corresponds to one of those rectangles we just saw, right? So first step we see is checkout. Then we have make a directory, test reports. Then we have download Selenium. Then we have start Selenium, right? So when we're looking at this build job, these individual steps are what we see in this UI view. So it's kind of a sequential list of the steps that make up a particular job, in this case, the build job. So if I click on any of these, I'll actually see the shell output. And because this is, I think we're running oh, I can actually check what Docker image are we running here. Looks like we're using the CircleCI Python 362 image, stretch browsers. So it looks like it's a browser testing image that has Python on it. I believe usually these are based on Ubuntu. So it's going to be an Ubuntu-based image. So these are going to be bash commands, bash command output. So if we look in here, like for example, make dir test reports, it ran that. Then if we look at this one, download Selenium, we'll see that it successfully downloaded Selenium. And I want to point out one nice thing about this view, or two nice things. First, it'll actually show you the bash code that it ran, right? So that's really handy when you're trying to debug if you have an error somewhere in here. Second, it'll also show you the exit code that you got, which is really handy because I know there's some utilities out there that will throw some really interesting exit codes at you. And when you have it right here, you can just kind of highlight this and search it and figure out what exactly went wrong. So I'm not going to drill too much farther down to this, but I wanted to point out a few other things from these views. So this is a very simple workflow. Again, we just have two jobs that are running in sequence, but with workflows and how you can structure them, you can actually come up with some pretty complicated and flexible like workflow structures in terms of how the jobs are organized and how they flow. So I'm actually going to show you, I'm going to jump to a totally different project. This is a React.js app that runs on AWS Elastic Container Service. And if I actually hover over, or this is a commit I made about less than a day ago, yesterday afternoon. And if you hover over, this little X that shows up next to the commit in GitHub, you can actually see all of the CircleCI jobs that ran against this commit. This is because we have a first-class integration with both GitHub and Bitbucket. So when you set up CircleCI, you log into CircleCI with your GitHub or Bitbucket user ID. This integration will be set up for any projects you set up in Bitbucket or in CircleCI. So one thing I wanted to point out here is that, imagine I push this commit. I'm sitting here, I'm waiting to see what the results of my tests are. And I can do that just by hovering over this icon, and I see there's a red X here. Well, I can click on this little details button, and that'll take me directly to the CircleCI user interface and directly to the error message relating to the test that failed. This is more powerful than it sounds, I think, because I know personally a lot of times when something goes wrong in my tests or with something I'm working on, my first thought is, oh boy, now I have to remember my domain login and I have to log into a bunch of VMs and find the job runner. Like I used to use a different CI/CD tool, which I won't name in this presentation, but I used to have to log into runners and dig around and figure out what was going on in the logs. This is a single click from your VCS provider that gets you directly to the error message. So personally, I'm a big fan of this particular feature. Saves me a lot of time in troubleshooting. Jumping back over to our, let's see, where were we? This workflow here. So you can see here, we ran some tests for this particular pipeline, and we ran 32 tests. If all the tests went fine and there were no errors, you'll just get a nice great job message. And we have the steps tab that we already looked at that shows you all the shell output, the test tab we just looked at, and then finally the artifacts tab. This is where you can access artifacts that you've uploaded to CircleCI. And that's when I mentioned earlier that we encrypt all of those in private buckets that and they're encrypted at rest. This makes it really easy when you run a test or you run some tests or a security scan or vulnerability scan. You can upload the results here and then download them, and just take a quick glance at them. Of course, you can also integrate with S3 or something else if you want to upload them elsewhere, but this is just a convenient way of being able to access those very quickly after running a pipeline. Okay, so I'm going to jump back over to my presentation and kind of go through some of the features here and talk a little bit about the configuration file and the basics of kind of the language we use to talk about CircleCI config. Actually, let me get some water first. I'm doing a lot of talking. Okay, so the configuration hierarchy in CircleCI looks like this. So a pipeline is what's triggered when you push a commit. If we go back over to our interface here, let's grab this. This is a single pipeline, right? And there's one workflow in it, but there could be more than one workflow in here, right? But this is the name of the pipeline, CircleCI demo Python Flask 1. A workflow is just a collection of jobs that I guess you could say they define some rules that determine how jobs run, right? And I mentioned I was going to show you a more complex workflow. If I jump back over to this project, you can see that right here. So this particular workflow, this test and deploy workflow is a bit more complex, right? I have a bunch of jobs running in parallel, and then I have a bunch of them that run in sequence after that. So this is all defined in a workflow. Next, we have a job. A job is typically something like build or node test or node, static code analysis or deploy, something along those lines. And then finally, a step, and steps for those individual rectangles that I kind of pointed out earlier in the UI. That would be something like make directory test reports, right? That's a single command that is part of an overall job like build. And I've got two sample projects that I've listed here. This is the CircleCI demo Python Flask project. That's that simple one with the two step workflow that I showed you in the beginning. And then the more complex workflow job is also here linked in the slide deck. So you can take a look at both of those if you're interested. So next I want to talk about some of the specific features that are available to CircleCI users. So one really, really useful one is what we call CircleCI orbs. And orbs, you can think of them, well, technically what they are packages of CircleCI config YAML that has predefined commands and executors defined as well as predefined jobs. Now, what does that actually mean? And how can you conceptualize that? I think the best way to think of it is as like you could think of it as like a library import in Python, right? So let's say you're writing a Python script and you need to find the square root of a number. You could write a function to do that from scratch using your math knowledge, right? Or you could use one of the many libraries out there available for Python that probably already has a built-in function to calculate a square root, right? So to put that kind of in a more of a CircleCI context, there are many tasks that you might want to perform, such as sending a message to a Slack channel, right? When a build is successful or when it fails. Or maybe you want to install the AWS CLI and send some AWS CLI commands. Or maybe you want to build a Docker image and post or send it to your AWS Elastic Container Repository, for example. Those are things that many other companies and many other teams out there want to do. And so we maintain some orbs, and our community maintains some orbs that will take care of those functions for you. So what does an orb look like here? Like the anatomy of an orb here. So an orb consists of three different parts. First thing is going to be commands. So these are sort of the, I guess you could think of them as like the functions, right, that make up the orb. So let's say I have like an AWS, actually, I'll just grab an example. Let me just show you. I think it'll be easier that way. Let's grab ECR. This is one of my favorite orbs. Yep, so to use this example, the AWS Elastic Container Repo, which if you guys aren't familiar with it, it's just an AWS service that hosts Docker images in a kind of a private, you could think of it as a private Docker hub sort of thing, but AWS version. The commands here are build and push image. So if you want to build and push to ECR, or if you just want to build the image and use it for local testing on CircleCI, log into ECR, so create an ECR session or push an image that's already been built. So these are examples of commands that exist in this orb. Executors, so executors define the runtime environment and settings for executing jobs. So you can see here, let's jump over here. The executor here is just default, so that's not very interesting, but basically if you need a pre-configured environment, so like let's say a Linux environment that has, or I'm sorry, a Docker environment that has some tools pre-installed in order for the rest of these jobs to work, you can use this executor to run, or to I guess, yeah, to run the commands that are specified in this orb. And then finally, you have jobs. So jobs are just collections of commands. So a command does one thing, like build an image. Then a job could maybe build it and push it to ECR. In this example over here on the right, here's kind of a simpler example, and you can see this through the pretty basic code we've got here. Here's a command that says say hello. There's one parameter called to. The default is going to be the username of the person using the circle, or I guess triggering the pipeline. Or you can pass a parameter to this command. And then the step is just to echo hello, and then that parameter to the terminal. You can see the executor here is just going to be a Docker image, and then we have just this bash, right? So, and you can specify a tag if you like, but it's not necessary. And then down here at hello build, the job hello build just runs the step say hello, right? Runs the command say hello. I'll show you a maybe clear example here. So we talked a bit about parameterized config here in the orb section a moment ago. Parameterized configs are kind of the core essence of orbs, in the sense that, again, an orb is sort of like a function. So the whole point of functions is you pass it parameters, and it does certain things with those parameters, and it might even return a value that you use somewhere else, right? So parameterization is very important for orbs. And then once you get the slide deck, we have a bunch of documentation on orbs that show how you can author your own parameterized jobs and show some of the parameterization in action at some of these links here. And just to give you an example of how parameterization can help you kind of clean up and make your configuration more compact. Without parameters, you would have to copy this, basically cut and paste this build job, again and again and again, just because we want to use different versions of Node, right? We're using 13, we're using 12, we're using 10. Here, I define the job. Let's see. Yep. So I just define the build job up here, and then I'm passing different parameters every time I call the job in the workflow. So you see version, I'm supplying 12 here, supplying 10 here, and it's going to run with that node Docker image tag based on the value I supply down here. And if I run it with no parameter at all, so if I run build, just build with no version parameter supplied, it'll use 13 as the default. So there's an example of how you can write some reusable configuration with CircleCI. So next, resource classes. And I kind of touched on this briefly before, but if you guys are familiar, which I'm sure most of you are, with using cloud services, this is a concept that you're probably well acquainted with. But when you run jobs on CircleCI, be they VM or container-based jobs, you can select the resource class that is used for that particular job based on the amount of compute resources needed for that particular job or workload, right? And what this really comes down to is you can I guess decide how much money you spend on a given job, and if you need a job that needs more resources, you could bump up the amount that's allocated to that resource or to that job. As you can see here, medium is the default, 2 vCPUs and 4 gigs of RAM. You can ratchet that down to just 1 vCPU and 2 gigs of RAM, or you can go all the way up to 20 vCPUs and 40 gigs of RAM for some truly compute intensive jobs that you might need to run. And we have an example down here in this picture where if you're running a parameterized command, let's say you're just uploading a file, you're running a command that grabs a key or something, or creates or logs in and stores a session token. that could be a very small, like say Docker container, for example. But if you're running a bunch of tests in parallel, you might need larger executors for that. And then, yep, and they talk about the bottom line, right? The money question here. So that this allows you to kind of strategically use the credits that you use to, I guess, allocate or spin up compute resources with CircleCI. Then speaking of testing in parallel, I wanted to talk briefly about parallelization. So there's kind of two ways that you can run parts of your pipeline in parallel in CircleCI, and they're related. Actually, one is a subset of the other one. So, first, you can do what I showed you, I think, in an earlier pipeline there, and it's pretty straightforward. Just running a number of jobs in parallel, right? These don't necessarily have to be related. In fact, in this particular pipeline, they're all unrelated. I'm running a node static analysis, I'm running some tests, I'm running a format check for my Terraform plan, and then I'm validating and outputting to file my Terraform plan, right? So I want all these to run in parallel because they don't depend on each other. So that's one way you could use parallelization with CircleCI. The second is to split tests. So test splitting is really powerful. Let's say you have 100, it's a pretty small number, but just for the sake of argument, let's say you have 100 tests you need to run against your software, right, against your build. You can either manually kind of split those tests up yourself. So maybe you know that, well, these 10 tests are very long and resource intensive, so we'll put those in one group. And then these next 20 tests are kind of in the middle, right? They take a little bit of resources, but not that much. So we'll put them in a second group. And then the last 70 tests are super quick, super easy. We'll put all those into a single group, right? So that's one way to manually split up your tests by kind of putting them in different files and pointing CircleCI to those different files. More interesting is when you get into the realm of, let's say you have thousands of tests, or I had a customer the other day who had to run 42,000 tests against their software, right, against each build. Well, I think during their integration test actually, but in that case, it becomes very cumbersome to actually have to, it becomes very cumbersome to actually have to manually bucket and choose which group each test is going to belong to, right? So what you can actually do with CircleCI is turn on timing data. And CircleCI will gather data and record data on how long it takes to run an individual test. And then you can set the number of, maximum number of parallel machines you want to run. So let's say I've got those 42,000 tests and I want to spin up a maximum of maybe like 10 machines. You can set an attribute called parallelization in your config file that will allow you to intelligently spread those 42,000 tests across, 10 different containers, say, right? And you don't actually have to do that splitting yourself. CircleCI will do it based on calculations of how long each test is going to take to run, and then find the shortest overall runtime for all of those 10 containers to complete all of your tests and and finish at roughly the same time. So that takes a lot of the effort into managing like runtime and helps you shorten the overall length of your pipeline runs. So CircleCI also has an API, and you can use this to manually trigger the pipeline, or manually trigger pipelines. You can use it to pull data about your pipelines, a number of different things. It's really kind of usage dependent, so I'm not going to go too deeply into what you can do with it. But when you get this slide deck, definitely take a look at this link, and it'll give you a good overview. It's a pretty good documentation. I'll just pull it up real quick of how to use the API, along with examples over here on the right-hand column that make it really easy to play around with. Another interesting feature we have is matrix jobs. So as you guys are probably aware, a matrix is really just a two-dimensional array, right, in the realm of mathematics. So we have, if you look over here on the right-hand side, we have a one-dimensional array, like just a regular array of operating systems. And then I have another array over here of strings. Now, a matrix matrix jobs are useful when you have kind of two arrays and you need to run jobs that incorporate every possible combination of the values from those two arrays, right? So if you look at the actual config file we have here, down here at the job section, we have this matrix test job, and it takes two parameters. One of them is operating system. The next one is subject. And so the steps here are checkout, and so it's going to clone the repo. That's what that checkout step does, and then it's going to run echo hello and then the subject parameter. Now that's all well and good, but in my workflows over here is where I actually specify that it's a matrix job. So you see I have matrix test, and then I have this matrix key, and then I have these two parameters that I'm supplying. And what this is going to do is actually create, again, combinations of all of these from all these two different arrays. So we've got 4 OS options here, 4 items in this OS array, and 3 items in this array of strings. And you can see down here, the resulting set of jobs, there's going to be 12, right? 3 times 4 equals 12. So we're going to have 12 jobs that are generated, 1 for each combination of each item in these arrays here. Now, why this is important? First, I'll give you a more real-world example of when you might want to use this. Here, it's kind of silly because we have OS and these strings, world, friend, and baby. But in real life, you might want to say run different versions of your application code, right? You might make a hotfix that applies to different versions, and you might want to test all of those kind of at the same time. Or you might want to run your code under different frameworks, or you might, if you're developing an Android or iOS app, it might be under different versions of Android or iOS. So that's when, instead of the subject line, you could maybe put in the version of the framework or a version of your code that you want to work with. So that's matrix code in a nutshell. Let's jump to secret rotation and contexts. So before I get into this, I want to step back just for a second and say that I guess a lot of times, like I mentioned in that security slide earlier, it's very convenient to be able to put environment variables or secrets in a place that CircleCI can access them, so that it's easy to deploy to a third-party service like AWS or or something along those lines. So in that vein, a lot of CI/CD tools already have project level environment variables, right? So if you have a project that you're working on that's a repo that you clone, and then you run your CI/CD pipeline and you deploy, let's say an ECS cluster to AWS, right? And then you push a service update to that ECS cluster. You're going to need AWS access and secret access keys in order to do that. Now, you don't want to be putting those in your, in plain text or something like that. So it's good to be able to store them as environment variables. Where a lot of teams run into trouble over the long run is, and I've had this problem myself, is that when you have a dozen projects or 30 projects, right, and they all need the same API keys, it becomes very difficult to have to manage those at the project level every single time. So contexts exist to solve that problem. Contexts are collections of secrets that exist independently of any one project. So you can define, say, your AWS access keys one time in a context, and then you can just point all of your projects at that context and tell them to use a particular context for a particular job. So let's say I have a deploy job for my React.js app that I just showed you earlier in this demo or in this presentation. For that one, I use a context that contains my AWS API keys and a couple other keys like a Slack API access key, so that I can integrate with these third-party services across a bunch of different projects. Now, the next question people usually have about context is, okay, hey, that's great. I can store my secrets in CircleCI and I know they're secure and I can use them across different projects. How do I rotate them efficiently, right? I'm not just going to put access keys in CircleCI and not change them for 10 years. That's not good security practice. Well, to address that, we recently came out with a new CircleCI CLI feature that allows you to modify contexts in an automated fashion. And so I'm going to jump over to a CLI test pipeline that I borrowed from one of my colleagues here. And if we look at the, and so just to back up a bit, this is the CircleCI demo context CLI project that's going to be linked in the slide deck. So you can take a look at that after this presentation. And down here, the steps that make up this, this context CLI test job. What we're going to do here is just, let's see, list the current context. So that's the first thing we're doing, just as a kind of a proof of concept to see what we're working with. I'm running this under my own account, so you can see I have a bunch of different contexts, can't say that word today, contexts already configured. Then if I go down to this next output, so we're going to create a test context, and you can actually see the command that I ran with CircleCI CLI. So here, CircleCI context list. Here I'm doing CircleCI context create, and then I have some environment variables that I use to name the to populate some values needed for the context. And I'm creating a context called test context, which you can see right here. It does not exist up here, so it was newly created. And then we're listing the contexts after creating that one. Down here, we're just going to show all of the secrets that are stored in that context, which right now there's 0. Then we're going to run this CircleCI context store secret. I don't know if you guys have used something like HashiCorp Vault or AWS parameter store, but syntax and all of this is a little bit probably reminiscent of those tools. And then down here, CircleCI context show, and we can see that we've created a secret successfully. Then down here, we're going to run the CircleCI context remove secret. We've deleted it, and then we can delete the context, and we no longer have that test context in our list of contexts. So what was the point of all that? I'm trying to show that with this new CLI feature, you can easily automate the rotation of your secrets, right? So if you generate the value of a secret elsewhere, you can have your pipeline pull it down and or automatically update API keys or whatever other secrets you might have stored in CircleCI. You can hook that into a secrets management system that you're already using, right? For example. Then we've already touched on this a little bit, but CircleCI has a pretty vibrant ecosystem of integrations here. So I'm going to start from the right and move left. We have what we call our CircleCI orbs. So these are orbs that we maintain, CircleCI maintains, that allow you to integrate easily and integrate with third-party services in your CircleCI pipeline. So we have an AWS CLI orb, an Azure CLI orb, Docker orb. We have a couple of orbs specific to Kubernetes as well. GKE, EKS, Jira. So a bunch of different major services. Slack is another very popular one. I use that one myself to get notifications for when my nightly builds fail. That's a really good one to have. And then on the left-hand side here, we have partner orbs. And these are actually going to be orbs that are maintained by our partners. So we've got JFrog and Rollbar, for example. They maintain the CircleCI orbs for us, and we work with them closely to make sure that they're working as expected and to help them improve those orbs. And then finally, down here we have community orbs, right? Don't have any examples of these on the screen because they don't usually have logos, but there's a ton of different ones to sift through and some pretty good ones out there. Chances are that if we don't have an official partner orb or a CircleCI orb for something you're trying to do, usually somebody in our community has written an orb that will help you accomplish the same thing. Next, I want to talk about some other use cases now that we've kind of covered the basic and kind of general use case for CircleCI. So as you are probably all aware, Kubernetes is becoming more and more popular and more widely adopted across all fields. And CircleCI, we've worked really hard to kind of make it easy for Kubernetes, Kubernetes companies or companies using Kubernetes to integrate their CircleCI pipelines and easily deploy to Kubernetes with CircleCI. So we have this cookbook that kind of guides you through using CircleCI with ECS. We have ECS, EKS, and GKE, pretty well documented here. And we're actively working on and working toward improving our Kubernetes documentation, because we do have a lot of customers who are Kubernetes users. So definitely take a look at this link if you guys are using Kubernetes or if you're interested in using it. And then like another example would be iOS and mobile app deployment and development. So I've only dealt with this a little bit, but if there's any mobile developers in the audience, you guys definitely know how much of a headache it can be sometimes to try to deploy an app to the iOS store, with all of the code citing that you have to deal with and a lot of the kind of idiosyncrasies of that process. Most of our mobile developers use Fastlane to deploy to the App Store, the iOS, the Apple App Store. And not just the App Store, but you can also deploy to Firebase, Visual Studio App Center. And we also have documentation, I don't have it on this slide, but for deploying to Android, right, the Google App Store, rather, in case you're an Android developer. And then finally here, we have quite a few tutorials that you can use that are based on, different languages or different operating systems that you might want to work with. And we also have quite a few example config.yaml files available kind of for your perusal. And these are really handy. I even use them from time to time just because, nowadays almost nobody starts writing a config file from scratch. You usually go on to Stack Exchange or something and grab it, cut it, paste it, put it in your your VS Code or whatever your IDE is and start editing there. So we try to make it really easy to get started that way by giving you kind of like templates to work with. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go ahead and switch gears over to Q&A now. And I'm going to look at my little Q&A window here, off screen, but I'm reading it. Let's see. So first question here is, how beneficial is CircleCI to use compared to Jenkins? That's a good question. We have a lot of folks interested in CircleCI who are current Jenkins users. And I mean, Jenkins is a great product. It's open source, which is really cool. And it is very, very customizable, right? Jenkins plugins are, famous for how numerous they are and how many different things you can do with them. But I would say some of the major benefits of, that CircleCI has over Jenkins are that because it's a cloud platform, it eliminates the need for plugins. Well, let me backtrack there for a second. It eliminates the management overhead associated with plugins, right? So I know with Jenkins, a lot of times you have these long, complex plugin dependency chains, and you might have dozens or hundreds of plugins, depending on how many teams are using your Jenkins instance. And it quickly becomes very complex when you try to scale out Jenkins more, to more than just a few developers, right? With CircleCI, first of all, a lot of the features that you would need Jenkins plugins for are already built in to the core product. So you won't need plugins for them at all. Right? And then second, if you need to integrate with third-party services, that's where you would use orbs. And orbs don't need any sort of installation or kind of overhead management. They don't have any management overhead associated with them. Let me actually jump over to one of these config files here. Let's look at this one. So if you want to use an orb, and again, this is kind of in the context of comparing this to like Jenkins plugins, right? Instead of installing a plugin to CircleCI, if you want to use an orb to, maybe interact with ECR like I was talking about earlier, what you would do is you just put orb AWS ECR at the top of your config file. And then if I look, let's see, if you want to, and when you actually want to use that orb in your config, you just use the command in that orb like that. And so that's all it really requires. Then, of course, there's the obvious benefit of not having to manage a Jenkins server or a fleet of, build servers in addition to the master Jenkins server, for example, because all of the Docker containers and VMs you'll spin up to run your jobs on CircleCI Cloud are going to be spun up on demand and then destroyed automatically when your jobs are done running. Okay. So then the next question here is, I'm interested with iOS app build and deploy to test flight and Firebase, but the current session is not relevant to iOS. So yeah, this session was meant to be just like an overview of CircleCI as a platform in general. So it wasn't really meant to kind of focus on iOS development in particular, but we do have pretty extensive documentation about getting started with iOS, and I've worked through some of this myself. So it's pretty comprehensive, and I actually, yeah, I'm looking. Okay, yep, and I would definitely recommend checking this out and reaching out to our support team if you have more questions about iOS development and some of the particulars for what's required there with CircleCI. Let's see. So next question is, can a config file be created and extended in multiple applications? I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but if the question is, can a config file be created that interacts with multiple different applications? Yes, in theory you could. So let's say you have multiple services that make up an application maybe. You can test the services kind of independently, and then you could bring them all up together in a single job to do end-to-end testing, for example, of all those services together. That's one thing you could do. If the question is about, can you, I guess, have a single config file that is extended to use different third-party services? Yes. For example, in that config file I just showed you, I'm actually interacting with Slack and I'm interacting with AWS, right, in the same config file. So there's that extensibility there over multiple applications. Next question is how to configure the Fastlane, or how to configure Fastlane for an iOS app which has 2 Apple IDs. One used for ad hoc and one used for App Store. Can you explain how to configure it? So again, off the top of my head, I wouldn't be able probably to give you a great explanation for that. That's something that would probably be better suited to like a written email exchange or an exchange with our support team. So definitely contact us if you don't see that in our iOS documentation, because I know working with Fastlane, and I've worked with it a bit myself, it can be kind of difficult to figure out what exactly is going wrong. And I think it's not so much the complexity, that's not so much dealing with CircleCI as it is the complexity of setting up Fastlane properly. Despite Fastlane having some really great documentation too, I have to admit they're pretty good about that. So yeah, definitely shoot us an email or open a support ticket with us and we can try to help you out with that. How effective is CircleCI to integrate with tools like Postman for running Postman collections? I actually think, well, to answer the question, it's something that's doable. You can integrate CircleCI pretty easily with Postman, and I know we have customers out there that do it. I believe there's a blog article that I'll try to dig up, and maybe I'll stick that into this presentation before we send it out in the tutorials and example projects section down here. But yeah, I know we do have folks who are using Postman and using that to trigger jobs and stuff. So it's definitely a possibility. Then the last question we have here is, let's say we have multiple pipelines and some of them are put on hold via the hold for approval. Do those pipelines affect the others in terms of resources? That's a really good question. So let me show an example of what is being talked about here. Let me grab an example of an approval pipeline. I know I have one. It's probably, looks like I might have canceled all of them. Okay, that's okay. I'll just jump back to this. And so if you look at this pipeline workflow, or this workflow, we have all these jobs. This job runs, then 4 run in parallel, then we have another job that runs, and then there's a manual approval job. And if you notice, I can click on this one, it turns into a little hand, right? And I can click on it. This one I can't click on because it's not an actual job. This is a manual approval step. So what that means is the pipeline will run and it'll stop at this point, and somebody has to come in here and manually click like a thumb icon to say like, okay, I want to continue this workflow, right? So what's being asked here is, do pipelines that are kind of stuck waiting for an approval, do they affect the allocation of other resources? No, they do not, right? They do not affect the allocation of other resources. So in fact, you shouldn't be consuming any additional credits if it's stopped in that waiting for approval state. So it shouldn't affect any of your other pipelines at all. Oh, awesome. So it looks like, yeah, Mike posted that that Postman API blog article for me right there. I appreciate that. And then we have one more question here. Can I evaluate CircleCI free of charge for some time? Yes, we have a free tier. So you can use that. You can sign up for that now and start trying CircleCI out on your own. And that's free to use indefinitely. The only caveat is that there are some restrictions on, say, like if you want to use Mac OS executors, or if you want to use some of the larger resource classes for your Docker containers or for your VMs, you would need to sign up for a paid plan for that. But you can, honestly, you can get pretty far with the free trial. We have a lot of customers who are just using the free trial and do well with it. So. All right. Looks like we only got about 2 minutes left, but we're out of questions. So I just want to say thanks everybody for hopping on. I know you guys are all busy, have busy schedules in the afternoon on a Wednesday, so I appreciate you joining, and look forward to hopefully talking to some of you guys in the future. Thanks a lot.